Welcome to Difficult Conversation Africa broadcast. I present to you the host, Yinka Olaito.
All right. The story of Africans can be told by several people outside Africans, and that narrative has continued for years. Unfortunately, when the hunter that is telling the story of the jungle, the lion stories are often submerged. And today, things are changing. People are saying that African narrative must be told by Africans. And that's the essence of this today conversation. I will introduce my guest later. But I want you to know that our topic today will be building legacy, telling African story. Like I said, for centuries, African narratives have been shaped by outsiders, sometimes misrepresented and sometimes incomplete. But today, the new generation is asking, and they are trying to reclaim the mic, saying that Africa should begin to begin to tell their own story, because they know the story better than any other person. And because of that, a new generation of storytellers are rising up and defending African image with such richness, resilience, and global influence. So we'll be looking out at how Africans are telling their story. And storytelling is not just about representation, it's also about the future generation that can inherit such pride. And to unpack this is my guest, Margaret Wanjiru, a global campaign strategist, a strategic leader in policy and communication, a brand storyteller who is interested in tech, policy, and climate communication. She's here today to help us unpack some of these. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Inka. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for coming and thank you for the work you do. So happy for seeing people like you telling the story in a better way to build an Africa that we can always be proud of and that we can always present to the next generation. Now, let's go to the first question. Defining legacy. When you hear that phrase, building legacy by telling African story, what does it mean to you?
To me, I would say that what comes to mind is telling our narratives in our language, telling our stories through our lenses, and also just using our own experiences, so our own lived experiences. The one person that comes to mind when I think about African legacy and storytelling is Semben, who is a filmmaker from Senegal, who was a filmmaker from Senegal. And the fact that he made a lot of his films and a lot of the conversations from an African lens, and he did not even care to translate because, with paraphrasing his words, his work is meant for Africans. It's not meant to center, for example, Europe. And so what comes to mind is kind of what he was talking about, just really telling our stories through our voices, through our own language, and through our own experiences without having to feel the need to translate and to make ourselves light and digestible for outside audiences. So that's what really comes to mind.
That's fine. Just one issue that came to mind in that your insight that you have just shared. That Senegalese person that you talk about that tell the story in his own language. The challenge I also see with that is that other Africans may not be able to relate with that story. What do you think?
Yeah, especially because we have Anglophone Africa, Francophone Africa, and also Portuguese. I think one of the easiest ways to bridge that is through collaboration. So one good example is in the Kenyan coast, there's a town called Lamu, and they usually have a festival of huts. And so when you go to Lamu, you'd think that everyone speaks Swahili, but some of them speak Swahili, some of them speak a very indigenous language there. And some folks also come from Nairobi to go experience the festival. And what I found that works really well is just collaborating. And when the hat makers work together and when the photographers work together, sometimes you do not necessarily have to understand what the other person is saying, but just being together together makes a lot of sense. I think also I think another example is just looking at music. Sometimes I listen to Senegalese music. They sing in French. I can speak a little bit of French now, but I'm not very fluent in it, I have to say. I think because Kenya, we are an Anglophone country. But the fact that I'm able to just sit and enjoy it without feeling the need to,
I'll follow through.
you know. So I do think would help, but also just keeping an open spirit, and just thoroughly keeping an open spirit while enjoying our stories, especially as Africans.
No. Thank you for that insight, because I'm just thinking that we should unpack that side of the story, because it's really important for us as African, so that we don't work in silo and begin to undermine what we are trying to, what we actually try to achieve. So, when we come to shaping narrative, for decades, African stories have often been told from the outside. Now, how do you think this has affected perception of the continent, both within Africa and outside?
I think I want to start from within Africa. When our stories are told consistently by folks who do not speak our language, folks who do not experience life the way we do, there's an element of feeling undermined. Especially, I think I want to lean a bit into climate work, and that's purely because that's like my experience. As Africans, we already have a lot of things that we do in terms of adapting to the changing climate. We know that how women work, how we actually look at farming and crop rotation and things like those. But when these stories are not told from us, they're told by us. They're told from a place of quote unquote primitive, which is a language and a word I absolutely loathe. And so that really undermines our capability. And that also really gets to touch into our self-esteem as a continent, I have to say. And so one way continuously, the one thing that we need to do is to continuously fight that feeling of being undermined and also that feeling of lowered self-esteem by leaning a lot more into what we already do, because it's been working. We know that our traditions have been helpful, especially when it comes to facing our very own problems. We do have problems as a continent, but we our collaboration, our coordination, our community building has been very, very key. And so I think the biggest thing from an African perspective is that when you're already doing something and someone comes to tell your story for you, there's a spirit of being undermined. And then when you look at it from an outside perspective, is folks also then do not even get to know our true stories, because then what they're seeing is something that's being filmed by someone who's not us, by someone who mostly doesn't understand our language. I think a good example is the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, which depicts Southern Africa as this very primitive part, and also makes fun of the language being spoken. And it's such a complicated language and a beautiful language when you think about it from an African perspective. But because the person who was filming and the person who was telling the story wasn't someone from Africa, wasn't someone from the southern part of Africa, really filmed it in a way that it's, oh my God, let's look at the primitive Africans. I think there's that two sides of the coin, what it does to our esteem, but also what then other folks get to see.
Yeah, I think you've nailed the point. What other folks need to see, and what are the motivation behind those storytellers, people from outside Africa, because that's really important. What is the motivation? Maybe the motivation they want to see is to see a poor and wretched Africa, and that's what they try to portray in every of their storytelling. And that will lead me to the next question, which is really important to me: ownership of story. Ownership of story is very critical. And what do you believe it takes for an African to fully own their story? What are the things they need to do? What do you think are very essential and pivotal for African to actually take ownership of the story? We should not also forget that who dictate, who blow the piper will dictate the tune. They have the media, they have the strongest of the media platform to actually push their stereotypical analogy. But what can African do to hold their story?
Mm, I would say there are three things that come to mind. I want to lean back again to collaboration, and then I'll talk a bit about teaching and keeping our traditions alive, and then also a bit of embracing change. So when it comes to collaboration, it can be a bit daunting to think about keeping a story alive when you're just by yourself. So, for example, as someone who lives in Nairobi and you want to tell like a clear picture of Kenya, that could sound like it's an insurmountable thing to do. But if you just go outside of yourself and see what maybe Uganda and someone from Uganda is doing, someone from Tanzania is doing, someone from Nigeria is doing, that kind of helps to just give inspiration. So keeping really like an open mind in terms of collaboration, getting to learn from each other, and then in the learning from each other, there's an element of continuously keeping alive the spirit of teaching, especially because times are changing, technology is changing. And so, what I might know at my age, someone younger than me might not know. And so, there is and there needs to be a continuous and sustained element of teaching what our story is, how we need to tell our stories, how our story has been told in the past. I think a good example, and I keep referring to examples from Kenya purely because I'm Kenyan. I think a good example I can give is there's a group of young Kenyans, and they have this, I want to call it a moving theater kind of organization. It's called Too Early for Birds. And they get to tell the political story of Kenya. And that story is being told not only to people our age, but to folks who are younger than us, to keep that alive. And I do feel like that continuously keeping the story alive, teaching younger generations of what we are, what makes us us, what our essence is, what we are fighting for as a continent. That helps a lot because then it keeps the messaging alive, even when I'm not there, even when older generations are not there. So that the younger generation then has also the tools that they need to, continuously also, for lack of a better word, fight back. And then the last thing is embracing change. And this could be seen in two ways, but we do know that currently a lot of things have moved into the digital space. So in as much as you're telling our stories, like for example with old film, what can we do with new tech? Can we also teach ourselves that, and can we also teach younger people? So I think those are the three things that come to mind: is the collaboration bit, but the most important thing I think is the keeping the teaching alive, so that the lessons and the stories keep trickling down to younger generations, and we do not lose the essence of who we are with the older generation as we age out.
Thank you, Margaret. One point that really struck the chord with me is teaching. And I think that most of us are not doing enough job in that area, particularly people of our age and above. I was watching a small video clip this morning where a Nigerian a Nigeria in Canada was hired in a bank, and the Canadian bank was expecting that the guy should be able to speak the local language where he came from, and he couldn't speak it. And that is one of the reasons was the fact that his parents never bothered to actually teach him his local God language, hoping that because he's no longer in Nigeria. And you see, but if you do not keep all these tradition and this teaching all along, that's why they said the indigenous languages will still get extinct, because we begin to speak and copy people, and then at the detriment of our own African languages and cherished culture. And I think that that will now drive us to that point you raised about teaching will now drive us into the next question, which is the role of history, and culture in storytelling. Now, how important is it that for African to weave history, tradition, indigenous knowledge system into the narrative of modern storytelling? How important is that?
I think it's important from two places. One from a culture place, but also two from learning about them, the discrimination and what Africa went through colonialism. It's something that it's important for us to learn. So when it comes to talk about from a culture place, it's just what you mentioned about keeping our languages alive, and we know that the rate at which we're losing our languages is a bit fast. I know there are people who've tried to bring campaigns and processes in place to just keep our languages. I think Wikimedia had started that a while ago, and one platform that actually is doing that also very well is TikTok, because it has the native element of the platform. People just get to speak in their language, and I realize that there are also creators who are now offering classes. I do think it's very, very important to just really look into what really makes us us. So what is our language? Where does that language come from? What are our cultures? And just really keep that alive, because we get to also learn how to exist in this world. Like, how did our forefathers exist? And what lessons can we bring from that? But also the other thing is learning about what colonialism did to us, because one of the reasons why we are losing our language is because we had a borrowed language. For Francophone Africans, it's English. For Anglophone Africans, it's French. And unfortunately, that has, I want to say, long-term effects, because then the only way you would have been able to move up economically is if you learn the language, so that you can be employable in the white person's world. And if you did not, then that meant you get to lose out on economic mobility. And so just getting to understand the implications of that, so that you do not also write it off as a thing that Africans just do for the sake, but understand the implications that come with it. I feel like that's the only way then you're able to make even better policies in place. So if you're losing our language because of the colonial legacy, how can we then bring our own language, like our own native languages, and teach that using the curriculums that we have gotten from the white people? So I do think
Again.
the two does really it goes hand in hand. There's a book that was put together in Senegal, actually, by a group of writers from across Africa, called Writing the Africa World. It talks a lot about just getting to understand our culture, understand our old religions, understand our own languages as a way to imagine a newer world after colonialism, because I mean, colonialism did not end many years ago. It's just 50 years ago, at least for countries like Kenya. So yeah, that's what I would say.
All right. That's quite insightful. Technology. In telling our story these days, we cannot run away from technology, and I think that you started a few lines around that, but I need you to speak to the fact that technology and storytelling, what digital platforms, social media, and streaming services, what do you think will do to African in the process of increasing our power of storytelling, and more importantly, in changing the narrative over time?
Mm. I think when it comes to tech, one of the big things I have seen, especially this year, but maybe from like 3 years ago, is how much it enables different Africans to share our story out there and to learn from each other. And the reason I say this is, I think a platform I can use is X, formerly known as Twitter, and how it has been used continuously as a public town square. And from that I think from Twitter, that's where I learned about NSARS as the movement from Nigeria, and how well the youth really talked about it and pushed against it. And then the learnings from that are some of the learnings that Kenyans, when we were doing them, and finance bill this year, that's some learnings we got from there. This is how you organize. This is how you make sure that everyone is kept safe during the movement. This is how you raise money to get people out of jail when they get arrested. And those learnings are also the learnings we see that have also been a bit picked by people from Togo in their resistance, and also in their fight against the current government. So I do feel like the digital platform gives us a place where we get to share and exchange stories, and share and exchange learnings, and also just pick inspiration, to be honest. So that's one, but also it's also a place to find joy and to learn what other people are doing, so that it's, how they say joy is also resistance, so we are not constantly fighting. The reason I say this is because one of the things I absolutely love about TikTok is Kikuyu talk. So one of the languages I speak as a Kenyan is Kikuyu. And that side of TikTok is just really wild. The jokes they tell, it's just really, really funny. And sometimes that surprisingly crosses over to other countries, and they're asking us to translate, and vice versa. and just having a space to learn other people's languages, other people's intonation, it's really, really fun. So I think it offers that a space for joy as resistance, but also as a space to pick learnings from like a very much organizing place. It's really, really important that we continuously embrace them, but also question them in the long run as well, because also
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you. Let's look at the issue of challenges and barrier. So, to storytelling, and I am saying that you are a storyteller. You know that telling story require funding. What other challenges do you see to, and that is around question 6 that I'm trying to ask question around. When it comes to authentic African stories, what are the challenges that you foresee? Don't also forget in storytelling there's censorship and all of them. What are your thoughts on challenges and barriers to storytelling in Africa?
I would say that two main ones that come to mind. Of course, it's funding. A lot of us want to tell really good stories. A lot of us want to tell a lot of inspiring stories, but everything requires money. And unfortunately, when you look at storytelling, it is framed as an art. And unfortunately, as a continent, we do not fund the arts, and we do not fund communication as a key thing, as we do not fund storytelling as a thing. And so for you to be able to tell stories, you have to work really hard to first of all get the money and then tell the story, which can be a bit, it can kill your spirit along the process. It does kill young people's spirits along the process. And so you have to like find ways in which to fund yourself. So I think funding is a really big thing. But also just believing that storytelling is core to development, because as a continent, of course, we are continuously developing, we are all continuously growing, and so there are other priorities, that are, especially like when you think about it from a policy perspective, and storytelling is really not one of them. And I do think that it's about time that we think as a continent, our storytelling and narrative telling needs to be very well funded, almost equally as other sectors as well, so that we can move at par with everybody else. Because when you look at the northern markets, and the global north, in as much as they invest in their infrastructures and all that, they also invest in the story that they tell about themselves. This is also, when you look at China, the story they tell about themselves is very, very core. And I do think that that's something that we need to think about, especially from like a structural policy perspective. And then outside of that, there's also available platforms where we can tell our stories. A lot of the platforms, especially when you look from a digital perspective, they're not owned by us, unfortunately. And so that means when priorities shift from a global politics place, they do not always shift in our favor. So maybe thinking of ways in which we can have our own platforms, would be a good thing. It's a long shot, but it's something that's worth thinking about anyway. Even if we start as early as now, I would say. So yeah, those are the two things that come to mind.
Yeah. That's a good line of thought, and I hope we will be able to follow it. I hope that Africans and African storyteller will be able to follow that line of thought and pay keen attention to those areas. Because of our time, let's go to global influence question. For me, how can African stories not only inspire Africans but can be used to inspire changes at the global level?
One of the ways in which we can do that is by being in global level spaces. A good example is, and I think I'm referring back to this because of the work that I do in climate. A good example is for climate. There's Africa Climate Week that's actually happening right now in Ethiopia. That is being highlighted globally. There's also COP. I can't remember the full word, but being able to be in those rooms, even if we only have one person in that particular room to tell our
Which is
stories, and that,
important.
yes, and even if it's just to tell from a comms place, and then we have someone from policy, just we need people in those rooms. It's great the work that we're doing offline, but we need to be in the rooms, in the important rooms, to sit and to tell our stories and to fight back even in those spaces in the little way that we can.
Yeah, that's really good. Now, building legacy, part of what we say about storytelling is about building legacy. Now, for the future, when you think about the future generation, say 50 years ahead or more, my thought is, what stories about Africa do you hope they will inherit and be celebrating? What kind of story do you think that in 50 years or more, people who will be living at that time, what kind of story do you think that they will have inherited or they will be celebrating based on our attitude for today?
I think if we continue telling our story from an African perspective and from an African lens, one of the things that would come out of it is a very rich and abundant story for Africa. For example, I know that right now we're talking about how Africa, for example, supplies 70% of cobalt, which makes even this conversation possible because it's used on my laptop, on your phone, and all that. And if you continuously tell that story and make it hold root, then that's a story that will be a narrative that will exist even in 50 years' time, that Africa was rich enough to be able to power the world into being able to have technology and be able to communicate and become a connected village. So I do think there's that element, but also the richness in our culture then gets to precede us as a continent. And the same way we hear about these northern markets, it's the same way the Africa vision will be seen globally. So that's really my hope. Honestly, that's really my hope, and that's also the reason why we, as a continent, need to consume our own stories, need to really puppeteer them, like really sell them out to everyone. Everyone that should is recommendations recommend an African thing. Like let's just put all of the weight behind it.
Thank you, Margaret. What stood out for me in this conversation is the inspiring aspect that story is not just about telling African story. It's about identity. It's an issue of identity. It's about an issue of reshaping. It's an issue of strengthening and straightening the narrative from what it used to be to what it should be, and that it is about building a legacy of generation ahead that we will all be proud of. Thank you, Margaret Wanjiru, for this insightful conversation. It has really been a good one, and I'm happy that we still have great African daughters like you who are championing the story, who are telling the story, who are doing a great work both at local and the global level. I'm so impressed by the thoughts that you share, and I think that in the future we can get back for a follow up for these to this conversation. Thank you for what you do, and thank you, Margaret, for coming on the show. See you in the next edition. And to our listener, we want to say thank you for listening to this episode. We encourage you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel and then to subscribe to our newsletter at www.difficultconversationafrica.org and many more. And therefore, and also follow us in different platforms on X, on Instagram, and Facebook. See you in the next edition. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you for listening to this episode. For inquiry, please send an email to info@difficultconversationafrica.org. Telephone 0809 591. Please follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Difficult Conversation Africa. See you soon.